Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of Roman gladiators. Those blood-soaked figures who fought in arenas across the empire to entertain crowds, who cheered for death like it was a chariot race. While Hollywood makes them look heroic, the truth is being a Roman gladiator seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Together, let's be clear. No one in ancient Rome woke up and said, "You know what I'd like? To stab a criminal in the throat for entertainment, while 50,000 people cheer and place bets on my survival." Becoming a gladiator wasn't a career path. It was more like a last stop on the life went horribly wrong train. Most Roman gladiators weren't mysterious warriors trained in elegant combat schools. They were slaves, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or people so desperate they literally sold themselves into a life of scheduled violence. If you were well off, you didn't become a gladiator. You bought one. If you had citizenship, land, or even a decent paying trade, you were in the audience, not the arena. But if you were captured in battle, condemned for a crime, or so deeply in debt that slavery looked like an improvement, congratulations. Someone somewhere was about to slide a contract across the table and whisper about glory, fame, and the slim possibility you might live long enough to buy your freedom. And that freedom, it wasn't a fun one. You weren't asked to fight honorable opponents in fair contests. It was usually other desperate souls, wild animals, or staged executions disguised as entertainment. The pay, theoretical, the job, horrifying, but by the time someone considered it, they had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no retirement plan. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension, no glory, at least not the kind you'd live to enjoy, and no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang up a sign that said professional arena combat by appointment. You just had to stay alive, fight when ordered, and never ever complain about the working conditions, especially not loudly in the barracks. Oh yeah, I'm a traveling olive merchant. The scars are ... very aggressive customers. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a Roman gladiator. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out, wearing leather armor and holding a rusty sword. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the entertainment that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live to spend your winnings. Let's burst the first myth wide open. Roman gladiators didn't train in some inspiring montage with wise mentors and uplifting harp music in the background. There was no inspiring speech, no teacher with a mysterious past, no pep talk about honor and glory. If you learned anything, it was by not dying the first few times you entered the arena. Most gladiators weren't trained professionals when they started. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of self-preservation and the ability to hold a weapon without immediately dropping it. If you had military experience, great. That meant you knew how to march in formation and follow orders. If not, well, Stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but doing it entertainingly while avoiding getting stabbed yourself, that takes skill or luck. Usually just luck. There were gladiator schools, yes, but don't imagine universities with professors of combat theory. These were more like brutal training camps, run by former gladiators or ex-soldiers who'd survived long enough to become instructors. The curriculum was simple: learn to fight, learn to die well, and learn to make it look good for the crowd. You didn't get taught military strategy or the finer points of swordsmanship. You figured it out while dodging a practiced sword, wondering if you just volunteered for the wrong kind of slavery. Weapons training, you got the basics. How to hold a gladius without cutting yourself, how to use a shield without tripping over it, and how to fall dramatically when wounded. Combat techniques were trial and error, with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your opponent was slightly less prepared than you were. Sometimes you just got lucky and the other guy slipped in the sand. There was no Roman gladiator hotline, just hope, basic instruction, and a strong stomach. Sure, if you were lucky, and I mean lottery winning, struck by lightning twice lucky, you might have been trained at a decent gladiator school with proper equipment and experienced trainers. Maybe an older gladiator showed you how to read crowd reactions, or where to strike for maximum spectacle without immediately killing your opponent. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived, because successful gladiators either died in the arena or earned their freedom and got as far away from the business as possible. They didn't hang around to teach the fundamentals of theatrical violence. Weapons training, forget elaborate sword choreography. You had a gladius, a shield, maybe some light armor, and whatever else the school could afford to give you without going bankrupt. So no, you weren't some legendary warrior. You were a person with calloused hands, basic combat skills, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with public performance. Success didn't come from extensive training. It came from survival instinct. You've learned how to fight by doing it quickly, messily, then trying not to get killed before the crowd got bored. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Just scars, crowd noise, and the creeping realization that you were very much expendable. Let's talk about why you became a gladiator in the first place. Freedom sweet, elusive, theoretically achievable freedom. The promise of it is what got you into this, but the reality, you got paid in hope and died in sand. When someone becomes a gladiator, they don't want a long-term relationship with violence. They want survival, a chance at glory, and ideally the opportunity to buy their way out of the arena before something with claws or a sharp sword ends the contract permanently. They offer you training, food, shelter, and the possibility of earning enough prize money to purchase your freedom. That's if you're feeling optimistic. But here's the thing. Earning your freedom is code for surviving long enough to accumulate winnings while not getting killed by increasingly dangerous opponents or progressively more exotic animals. So you enter the arena, you fight for your life, maybe defeat a condemned criminal or wrestle a bear. Not pretty, not poetic, not remotely fair. And when you survive, yes, about that payment. The winnings were real, but they were also carefully calculated to keep you fighting. You'd get enough to feel like you were making progress, but never quite enough to buy your freedom outright. It was the ancient equivalent of a subscription service designed to keep you coming back. A knife to the chest is permanent, but hope keeps you signing up for the next fight. And even when you did accumulate some money, it was never quite enough. Not for the risk, not for the trauma, not for the 3 months you spent recovering from a lion bite while wondering if your career was over. You get a handful of coins, a pat on the back, and a reminder that your next fight was already scheduled. Also, fun fact, some gladiator contracts were essentially death sentences. You'd be told you were fighting for honor and freedom, only to find out you were facing a seasoned veteran with years of experience, while you'd been training for 6 weeks. Congratulations, you just walked into a rigged game with your life as the stakes. And even when the fights were real, you couldn't exactly go to court and file a complaint. Your Honor, I'd like to sue the Lanista for breach of gladiator contract. The lion was larger than advertised. The only court you'd see was the one where you were the entertainment, so you learned to take what you could, survive as long as possible, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the trainer who swore this career would change. Your life, it did mostly by shortening it considerably. So you've taken the contract, you've been lied to about the odds of survival. You're probably going to die in front of cheering strangers. Now, let's talk gear. Forget the movies with their elaborate armor and gleaming weapons. There were no custom breastplates, magical swords, or shields blessed by Mars himself. Your equipment consisted of whatever the gladiator school could afford to give you without going bankrupt. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead gladiator's locker, lucky, you had decent armor, not ornate, not blessed by priests, just functional, hopefully rust-free, and ideally something that didn't smell like the last guy who died wearing it. Weapons came in different varieties, depending on your assigned fighting style. Gladius and shield if you were a standard fighter, net and trident if you were a retiarius, or maybe just a sword and your wits if the school was feeling economical. But you didn't get to choose your weapon based on personal preference or fighting style. You got what you were assigned based on what entertained the crowd. Armor. It existed, sure, but it wasn't as protective as you'd hope. Most gladiator armor was designed more for show than survival. Elaborate helmets that limited your vision, decorative breastplates that left your sides exposed, arm guards that looked impressive but didn't cover much. The goal was to make you look like a warrior while ensuring the fights remained exciting, which meant ensuring they remained dangerous. Shields were your best friend, your lifeline, and your only reliable protection. You could block with one, bash someone with it, or hide behind it when things got desperate. But shields were heavy, unwieldy, and not much help against multiple opponents or large predators, and you didn't get backups. If your sword bent, broke, or flew out of your hands during combat, time to improvise. Sand in the eyes, worthwhile tactic. Grabbing a fallen opponent's weapon. If you could reach it without getting stabbed, theatrical surrender and hoping for mercy, desperate times called for desperate measures. You carried your equipment from fight to fight, and you kept it close, not for sentimental reasons, but because, in this line of work, your weapon was your employee, your boss, and your only chance at seeing tomorrow. There were no upgrades, no tinkering with gear between matches. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed it didn't betray you mid-fight. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that kept you alive. It was you, alone, under-equipped, and expected to perform miracles with basic gear while thousands of people bet on whether you'd survive the afternoon. Gladiators weren't hired to fight random criminals in practice sessions. No one paid admission to watch you spar with Jeff, the sleepy pickpocket. Your opponents were dangerous. Other gladiators, wild animals, condemned prisoners with nothing to lose, and sometimes even professional soldiers, and those opponents, they were very hard to survive. First, there were the other gladiators, not beginners like you, veterans with years of experience, dozens of victories, and the kind of muscle memory that comes from killing people professionally. Some had specialized in specific fighting styles. Others were just naturally gifted at not dying. You'd spend days watching them train, memorizing their moves, and realizing that your 6 weeks of basic instruction probably wasn't going to be enough. Second, there were the animals. Not house cats or friendly dogs, lions, tigers, bears, and occasionally more. Exotic creatures shipped in from across the empire specifically to eat people in front of audiences. If you thought fighting a human opponent was challenging, try facing a 400-pound predator that hadn't been fed in 3 days and saw you as dinner. Third, there were the condemned prisoners, people who had been sentenced to death but were given the opportunity to fight their way to freedom. Some were hardened criminals with nothing to lose. Others were political prisoners or rebels who'd rather die fighting than be executed quietly. Either way, they were desperate. And desperate people fight with terrifying intensity. And finally, there was the crowd itself. 50,000 Romans screaming for blood, making noise that could be heard for miles, placing bets on your survival. One wrong move and you'd hear 50,000 people collectively expressing their disappointment. The pressure was psychological torture designed to make even experienced fighters make fatal mistakes. Gladiators weren't just fighting opponents. They were fighting fear, exhaustion, and the knowledge that entertainment value often mattered more than fair competition. You would spend hours learning your opponent's fighting style, only to discover the day of the fight that the rules had changed. The weapons were different, or you were facing something completely unexpected. And don't get excited if you heard you were fighting during a major festival. Yes, the prize money might be higher, but so were the stakes. Festival games meant exotic opponents, elaborate scenarios, and thousands more spectators. Even getting into the arena alive was an achievement. Getting close to victory could take months of preparation, studying opponents, building stamina, and learning to read crowd reactions. And when the moment finally came, you had one chance, one precise, perfect, non-fatal mistake moment, or you'd become the afternoon's entertainment in the worst possible way, with your defeat cheered by people who'd never learned your name. Let's be honest. When you picture a Roman gladiator, you probably imagine impressive armor, dramatic poses, maybe a mysterious helmet that conceals your identity while you stride confidently into the arena. Reality, you looked like a desperate person in borrowed equipment, trying very hard not to panic. Gladiator gear in ancient Rome wasn't exactly high fashion. You didn't have custom-tailored armor or equipment fitted specifically for your fighting style. You had whatever the school could afford to provide, often second-hand, sometimes third, or fourth-hand, and definitely still carrying the sweat and fear of its previous owners. The goal was to look impressive, enough to entertain the crowd, while staying functional enough to keep you alive. But impressive in Gladiator terms meant elaborate helmets that severely limited your vision, decorative armor that left vital areas exposed, and weapons that prioritized spectacle over practicality. You didn't look intimidating because of your gear, you looked intimidating because you were about to fight someone to the death in front of thousands of strangers. Your armor wasn't meant to make you invincible, it was meant to make your eventual wounds look more dramatic. And forget about secret identities. There were no masks that concealed your face while projecting an aura of mystery. Most Gladiator helmets were designed to amplify sound, both your heavy breathing and the crowd's reaction, while making it difficult to see peripheral threats. Great for drama, terrible for survival. Even assuming you made it to the arena without tripping over your equipment, Gladiator schools weren't full of patient instructors. Trainers noticed everything, how you held your sword, how you moved in. Armor, whether you flinched when facing a practice opponent. You were always one. I've never seen you hold a shield properly, away from being assigned to face something with very large teeth. And if your gear did fit correctly, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for potentially hours, while pretending not to notice all the ways you could be killed. Also, backup equipment. It didn't exist. If you needed to look different, or older, or more experienced, you were stuck with whatever cosmetic improvements could be made with dust, oil, and hope. The truth was, your appearance didn't protect you. It gave you maybe 5 minutes of psychological advantage. After that, you had to actually fight, win, and survive. And if anyone saw through your facade of competent warrior, well, let's just say no one wanted to be the gladiator caught in the arena wearing impressive armor while clearly having no idea how to use any of it. In Roman times, if you were a gladiator, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a loyal trainer who believed in you, a clever doctor in a secret infirmary, or a manager who gave you encouraging pep talks and strategic advice. You had yourself, your assigned equipment, and crippling awareness that everyone around you had a financial interest in your performance. There were gladiator schools, at least ones you could count on to keep you alive long enough to be profitable. And if there were whispers of brotherhood among gladiators, it was mostly the kind of camaraderie that develops when people face death together. Meaningful but temporary, because tomorrow one of you might not be there. You were more likely to befriend a stable slave than another professional fighter who might be assigned to kill you next week. Why the isolation? Because in your business, the fewer people who knew your weaknesses, the longer you lived. Every friendship was a risk. Every conversation a potential source of intelligence for future opponents. Companionship, laughable. Friends asked questions about your injuries, your fears, your escape plans. Lovers noticed scars, blood stains, and why you always slept facing the door with a weapon within reach. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to get attached to anyone who might not survive the next set of games. Even fellow gladiators kept strategic distance. Sure, they understood your situation better than anyone, but they also knew that emotional attachments made you vulnerable. You were that person who made other people disappear for entertainment. They respected your skills, but feared what association with you might mean for their own survival, and don't expect sympathy from the outside world. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after killing someone for sport. If you talked about your job, people assumed you were either lying or dangerous, and they weren't wrong. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your trauma to yourself. At Gladiator schools, you sat in whatever corner offered the best view of all entrances, back to the wall, eyes always scanning for threats. You never relaxed completely. You never trusted entirely. You didn't make friends unless someone proved their loyalty in blood, and even then, it probably wasn't permanent. Being a Roman gladiator meant perfecting the art of emotional isolation, not just from society, but from every life you never got to have. You learned to live completely in the present, because the future was always one fight away from not existing. Let's say you took the assignment. You trained as well as you could. You entered the arena wearing your borrowed armor, and then you froze. Maybe your opponent was larger than expected. Maybe the crowd's bloodthirsty roar shattered your concentration. Maybe you got the shakes at the worst possible moment, and your sword hand trembled like a terrified rabbit. Guess what? You're now dead. Because failure for a Roman gladiator wasn't a poor performance review or a reduction in prize money. It was a public, painful, and wildly theatrical death, often involving weapons, wild animals, or the thumbs-down gesture that sealed your fate forever. Missing your chance to strike meant losing the fight. Your opponent lived, and you immediately became entertainment of a different sort. Suddenly, you weren't a warrior, you were a victim, and the crowd that had been cheering for you moments earlier was now deciding whether you deserved mercy or death, and those spectators you'd hoped to impress. Now they were motivated to see blood. Sometimes it wasn't even your opponent you had to worry about. It was the crowd itself. If you failed to entertain, if your fight was boring or brief, you were no longer an asset to the games. You were a liability that had wasted everyone's time and money. Failure also meant shame. The silent, humiliating kind. You didn't just fail to win. You failed to die well, to entertain properly, to justify the cost of your training and equipment. And for gladiators, entertainment value was survival. Anything less, and you might as well have painted a target on your chest and practiced your final words. There were no second chances. No sorry, the sand was slippery, I'll try again tomorrow. You had one moment in the arena, one opportunity to prove your worth. And if you blew it, the best you could hope for was a quick death before the crowd got bored and demanded something more interesting. Failure didn't matter. How many practice fights you'd won or how many months you'd spent preparing. No one cared that you'd survived basic training, because in this profession you were only as good as your last fight. And if your last fight ended with you face down in the sand, you'd better hope someone remembered you fondly, because there wouldn't be a next time. So you did it. The plan worked. Your sword struck true. Your opponent fell, and the crowd erupted in approval. No screams of pain, no angry spectators, just cheers and the knowledge that you'd survived another day. Congratulations. Now prepare for your next fight, because being a successful gladiator in Roman times didn't mean retiring to a villa with your prize money. It meant proving yourself again and again, until you either earned your freedom or died trying. Because surviving one fight didn't make you a champion. It made you a commodity worth preserving for future entertainment. There was no victory celebration, no post-fight interview with admiring fans. You survived, and your reward was the opportunity to do it again. The moment your opponent hit the sand, your new job became preparing for whoever was next. Bigger opponents, more dangerous animals, more elaborate scenarios designed to test your limits. The crowd wanted escalation, and the game organizers were happy to provide it. Your success didn't earn you safety. It earned you a reputation. And in the gladiator business, reputation meant you'd face increasingly challenging opponents until someone finally proved stronger, faster, or luckier than you were. Winners didn't get easier fights. They got harder ones. And let's talk about your fellow gladiators. Assuming you'd actually managed to kill or defeat someone who was probably in the same desperate situation you were, you now had to walk back to the school knowing that tomorrow you might face someone just as skilled, just as desperate, and just as determined to survive. The prize money was real, but it was also carefully calculated. You'd receive enough to feel like you were making progress toward freedom, but never quite enough to actually purchase it. Because a gladiator who could afford to leave was a gladiator who wouldn't fight anymore, and that was bad for business. Even when you succeeded, you walked away with coins in one hand and the knowledge that success had made you more valuable and therefore more likely to face increasingly deadly challenges. Because success didn't mean survival, it meant starting the whole deadly game over with higher stakes and more experienced opponents. So yes, you won the fight. Now try to sleep, knowing that victory just bought you a ticket to face something even more dangerous next time. If being a Roman gladiator wasn't already miserable enough, enslaved, trained for violence, and fighting for entertainment, you also had to deal with the wonderfully creative superstitions of the people around you. Because in ancient Rome, gladiators weren't just entertainment. They were considered both blessed and cursed, touched by the gods and marked for death. To the average Roman citizen, you weren't just a fighter in armor. You were someone who lived so close to death that you'd absorbed some of its power. Why else would you be able to survive in the arena while others fell? Logic wasn't exactly popular when it came to gladiators, but superstition, that was everywhere. Some believed gladiators possessed supernatural strength or were favored by Mars, the god of war. Others claimed you were cursed, destined to die violent deaths as punishment for some cosmic crime. One popular belief suggested that gladiator blood had magical properties. It could cure epilepsy, ensure fertility, or even grant courage to those who drank it. Imagine walking through Rome and hearing whispers. Don't stare too long, he might challenge you to combat, or touch his sword, and you'll absorb his fighting spirit. Even your equipment was suspect. Carrying gladiator weapons outside the arena, clearly they were blessed by Mars himself. Using gladiator training techniques, that wasn't skill, that was divine intervention. You'd think this supernatural reputation might help you. After all, people believed you had special powers, right? But the reality was more complicated. Superstitious Romans didn't just admire you, they feared you, and fear made people do unpredictable things. Your reputation made people either worship you or avoid you entirely. The second someone died unexpectedly in your vicinity, illness, accident, choking on a grape, someone would whisper, maybe it was the gladiator's curse. Maybe death follows him. You could be blamed just for existing in the same neighborhood. As bad luck, that meant you had to be careful everywhere. Stay too long in one place, and suddenly a priest is performing protective rituals, while citizens throw salt over their shoulders and mutter prayers. And heaven help you if you were caught with anything remotely unusual: foreign coins, exotic food, or even a different accent. That's all it took for someone to shout "cursed killer" and gather a mob. In a world that believed the gods directly intervened in daily life, being too good at violence made you either blessed or damned, and Romans weren't always sure which was worse. Poison, the gladiator's least favorite opponent, a quiet kill. No cheering crowds, no chance for heroic last stands, just a meal that tasted slightly off, followed by increasingly unpleasant symptoms. That's the theory. In practice, poisoning gladiators in ancient Rome was like trying to kill a professional athlete with herbal tea and wishful thinking. First off, gladiators weren't easy targets for poisoning. They lived in schools with controlled food supplies, supervised meals, and trainers who had financial investments in keeping them alive. You didn't have access to gourmet cuisine or exotic delicacies. You ate what everyone else ate, when everyone else ate it, under the watchful eyes of people whose job was to keep you fighting. There was no precise dosing. You didn't have access to refined toxins or convenient little pills labeled fast-acting doom. Ancient poisons were plant-based, mineral-based, or made from animal parts. Some worked quickly, some took days, some just made you sick enough to lose a fight without actually dying. Not exactly reliable for someone whose survival depended on peak physical performance. Also, gladiator schools were prepared for sabotage. Your food was often prepared communally, tasted by slaves, and distributed under supervision. If someone wanted to poison you specifically, they'd have to get past multiple layers of security and risk poisoning dozens of other valuable gladiators in the process. Gladiators were too valuable to poison casually. Schools had significant investments in training, housing, and equipment. Killing a promising fighter with poison was like burning money. Even your enemies preferred to defeat you in the arena where it could be profitable rather than eliminate you quietly, even assuming someone did manage to slip poison into your food. The next part was unpredictable. Ancient toxins weren't precisely calibrated. One dose might make you slightly nauseous during your next fight. Another might kill you before you ever reached the arena. A third might just give you stomach cramps and a renewed appreciation for bland food. And if you were poisoned and survived, guess who they'd blame? Not the cook, not the food suppliers. You, the gladiator with the suspicious reputation and unnatural ability to survive deadly situations. So poisoning wasn't efficient. For targeting gladiators, it was risky, slow, and full of variables, none of them in the poisoner's favor. You'd think that if you successfully entertained crowds, survived multiple fights, and became famous throughout the empire, someone would remember your name, maybe build a statue, write some poetry, carve your victories into marble for future generations. Nope, you were a gladiator. That meant your name was only remembered as long as you kept winning. At best, you were a local celebrity. Some graffiti on a wall, a few betting records, or mentions in someone's personal letters. You might have pulled off the most legendary fights of the century and still ended up as that gladiator who fought the lion and survived in the historical record. In fact, that was almost inevitable. Your sponsors didn't want you to be remembered as an individual, they wanted you to be remembered as entertainment. The fewer personal details people knew about you, the easier it was to market you as whatever character the crowd wanted to see. Noble savage, fallen hero, foreign warrior, you became whoever sold tickets. So your real name was buried the moment you entered the arena. If you used one at all, it was probably assigned by your trainers, based on your fighting style, your physical appearance, or your supposed origin. You didn't sign autographs. You didn't give interviews. You existed as a performer, not a person. And forget about honor among gladiators. There were no monuments for courage, no stone tablets commemorating the fighter who gave his life for the entertainment of Rome. If a senator wanted recognition, he built temples or funded public works. You got wooden swords if you were lucky, unmarked graves if you weren't. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be forgotten. You'd become a cautionary tale whispered among new recruits. Don't get cocky. Remember what happened to Spartacus. Yes, and look how that ended. That was your legacy. Not fame, not respect, just a reminder that even the greatest gladiators eventually fell. In the end, gladiators were anonymous by design. You weren't supposed to leave a mark on history. You were supposed to provide temporary entertainment and then fade away. And if you stuck around long enough to be truly memorable, that was usually because your story ended in spectacular failure. So, you survived multiple fights, dangerous opponents, and the constant threat of death for entertainment. You even managed to accumulate some prize money, a miracle in itself. Now all you have to do is keep your head down, avoid making enemies, and trust that your continued success will eventually earn you freedom. Right, wrong. Because in the world of Roman gladiators, there was one rule even more sacred than don't die in the arena. Never trust anyone, especially the people who profit from your fighting. Your trainers, school owners, and game sponsors didn't keep you alive out of affection. They kept you alive because you were profitable. Once you became successful enough to consider retirement, you became a different kind of problem. You knew too much about how the games worked, who placed bets, and which fights were arranged for maximum entertainment value. That made you valuable as long as you kept fighting, but dangerous if you ever tried to leave. Your trainers and sponsors didn't want former gladiators walking around with inside knowledge about fixed fights, rigged betting, or the business arrangements that made the games profitable. So what did they do? They made retirement nearly impossible to achieve. The prize money was real, but the path to freedom was carefully controlled. You could buy your way out, in theory, but the cost kept increasing as your value as a fighter grew. You could earn your wooden sword through exceptional service, but exceptional was defined by people who benefited from keeping you in the arena. There were even cases where successful gladiators were kept fighting through legal technicalities, contract modifications, or simple refusal to honor agreements. No refunds, just extended service contracts and the growing realization that success had made you too valuable to release. And if you dared to complain about your treatment, threaten to stop fighting, or demand the freedom you'd supposedly earned, that was bold and also potentially your final mistake, because powerful people in ancient Rome didn't negotiate with their property. They replaced it. If you were lucky enough to actually achieve freedom, you still had to worry about enemies from your fighting days. Former opponents, supporters, or people who'd lost money betting against you. Freedom meant leaving the protection of the gladiator, school, and facing the world as a former killer with a famous reputation and no legal status. You were the secret that couldn't talk, the investment that couldn't be allowed to depreciate. Even success wasn't enough to guarantee genuine freedom, because in the gladiator business, the most valuable fighters were the ones who kept fighting until death made retirement. Irrelevant, let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived the fights, the politics, the constant threat of death, and the efforts of your own trainers to keep you fighting forever. Now, what? You retire? Absolutely not. Because in Roman times, gladiators didn't get peaceful retirements. There were no farewell ceremonies, no quiet farms in the countryside, no pensions paid in gold coins and grateful recognition. You didn't fade into a peaceful life teaching swordwork to the local youth. You vanished or you died, often both. The problem was simple. You were never truly safe. Even if you somehow managed to buy your freedom or earn your release, your past didn't just disappear. You had too many enemies, too many people who'd lost money betting against you, and too much knowledge about the darker side of arena entertainment. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And even if no one came after you directly, and that's a very big if, you had to live with constant fear that someone might, that a new gladiator, young and eager to prove himself, might challenge you to a fight, that a vengeful family member of someone you'd killed might seek revenge. So you changed your name again. You moved to a village where no one asked questions about scars or why you couldn't sleep through thunderstorms. You faked a limp, sold pottery, pretended you'd once worked as a guard for a merchant caravan, but even then you didn't rest well. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept a weapon hidden under the floorboards next to the pouch of coins you'd never touched, because they still carried the memory of every fight you'd survived to earn them, and you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of scheduled violence and public death had done something to your mind. Every loud noise made you reach for a sword that wasn't there. Every stranger might be a former opponent seeking revenge. You stopped dreaming because nightmares were worse than insomnia. You couldn't love because love required vulnerability, and vulnerability was something no gladiator could afford. You couldn't relax because relaxation got people killed. You couldn't laugh too loudly because drawing attention was dangerous. The truth was, there was no end game for a Roman gladiator, just a slow, paranoid fade into obscurity, always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped into the darkness and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now you've probably figured it out. Being a Roman gladiator wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even profitable in any meaningful sense. It was a grim, thankless, short-lived career, wrapped in blood-stained leather and followed by crowds of people who wanted you to die entertainingly. You wouldn't last. Not a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with all the wrong assumptions. That you'd be heroic, in control, a warrior poet fighting for honor and glory. But what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one bad decision away from becoming an afternoon's entertainment. You'd slip into the Gladiator school, eager for training, ready for combat, only to discover that your instructors were former fighters who'd survived by being ruthless. Your fellow trainees were desperate criminals or slaves with nothing to lose, and the whole system was designed to extract maximum entertainment, value from your inevitable death. You'd freeze at the wrong time, face an opponent you weren't prepared for, get spotted by a trainer who realized you had no idea what you were doing, and suddenly you're not a warrior, you're tomorrow's victim. Then what? You run, but you're not used to Roman terrain. The sand of the arena, the weight of unfamiliar armor, the absolutely insane noise level of 50,000 people screaming for blood. You slip, fall, get tackled by a retiarius who's been fighting professionally for 3 years and sees you as an easy victory. And let's say you survive that. Then you deal with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future except the next scheduled fight. Just whispers, rumors, and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and broken, hiding behind a false name in some frontier town that still believes gladiators are blessed by the gods. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try, because the gladiator's life wasn't heroic. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spat out nothing but entertainment. It offered glory without peace, fame without freedom, and purpose without hope. You didn't make history. You were consumed by it, and the only thing waiting for you at the end was sand, blood, and silence. A silence no one would question, because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. But let's dive deeper into the daily reality of gladiator life, because the misery extended far beyond just the fighting. Your typical day as a Roman gladiator started before dawn and ended with the grim knowledge that tomorrow might not come at all. Wake-up calls in gladiator schools weren't gentle affairs. No soft bells or gradual stirring. More like a trainer banging a wooden practice sword against the bars of your cell while shouting about how today's the day you finally prove you're worth the grain they've been feeding you. Pleasant dreams, not when you're sharing cramped quarters with dozens of other fighters who snore, talk in their sleep about the people they've killed, and occasionally wake up swinging at phantoms. Your morning meal was pure practicality. Barley porridge, dried beans, maybe some stale bread if the school was feeling generous. No seasoning, no variety, no consideration for taste. The goal was to provide enough energy for training without wasting money on anything that might be considered enjoyable. And you ate quickly, because lingering over food was seen as a luxury gladiators couldn't afford. Physical conditioning started immediately after breakfast. Not the dramatic sword work you might imagine, but hours of grueling exercise designed to build stamina, strength, and pain tolerance, running with weighted packs, lifting stones, endless repetitions of basic movements until your muscles screamed and your lungs burned. The trainers weren't interested in making you comfortable. They were interested in making you useful. Combat training came next, and this is where the reality diverged sharply from the glamorous image. Most of your practice was against wooden posts, learning to strike accurately while maintaining balance and protecting yourself. When you did spar with other gladiators, it was with blunted weapons under strict supervision, because injuring valuable fighters during practice was bad for business. You learned not just how to attack, but how to make your attacks look dramatic. how to grunt convincingly when struck, how to fall in ways that wouldn't cause serious injury, how to time your movements for maximum visual impact, because entertainment value was just as important as combat effectiveness. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical training. Every day you faced the knowledge that you were being prepared for someone else's amusement, that your pain and fear would be converted into profit for people who saw you as livestock. The trainers made sure you understood this. No false hope, no pretense that you were learning a noble art. You were being taught to die beautifully. Afternoons were often spent in maintenance tasks around the school, cleaning weapons, repairing armor, tending to the animals that might eventually be turned loose on you in the arena. It was a constant reminder of your place in the hierarchy. You weren't just a fighter, you were property that needed to maintain itself. Meals were equally cheerless affairs, the same bland food, eaten in silence while everyone contemplated the training session they'd just endured and the uncertain future they all faced. Conversation was discouraged because friendships made fighters. Hesitant to kill each other when ordered, isolation was policy. Evenings brought no relief, no entertainment, no recreation, no moment when you could forget what you were training for. Some gladiators spent these hours practicing movements they'd learned during the day. Others stared at the walls, trying not to think about home or family or the life they'd never have. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares and the sounds of other fighters having their own troubled dreams. And this routine continued day after day, week after week, month after month, until either you were deemed ready for the arena or you broke under the pressure. There was no graduation ceremony, no moment when someone declared you fully trained. One day you were simply told that your first fight had been scheduled, and everything you'd endured was about to be tested in front of a crowd that wanted to see you bleed. The worst part, this grinding, dehumanizing routine was considered the good part of being a gladiator, because at least during training you were still alive. Let's discuss the economics of being human merchandise, because gladiators existed within a complex business structure that treated them as both investment and product. Understanding this system helps explain why escape was so difficult and why even successful fighters rarely achieved genuine freedom. Gladiator schools operated on surprisingly sophisticated financial models. The initial cost of acquiring and training a fighter was substantial. Purchasing a slave, providing food and housing, hiring trainers, maintaining equipment, a school might invest the equivalent of several thousand modern dollars in a single gladiator before seeing any return. This investment created perverse incentives. Schools wanted their gladiators to survive long enough to be profitable, but not so long that they became expensive to maintain. The sweet spot was a fighter who could win enough matches to generate revenue, while eventually dying before accumulating enough prize money to buy freedom. Your value as a gladiator was calculated with brutal precision. Age, physical condition, fighting record, crowd appeal, and projected lifespan all factored into your market price. Young, attractive fighters with dramatic fighting styles commanded premium rates for arena appearances. Older, scarred veterans might be valuable for their experience, but were considered declining assets. The betting markets added another layer of complexity. Successful gladiators could generate enormous gambling revenue, but this also made them targets for match-fixing schemes. Some fights were predetermined, with both gladiators understanding their roles in the theatrical performance. Refusing to participate meant punishment or death. Prize money for gladiators was carefully structured to provide motivation without enabling escape. You might receive enough coins after a victory to feel wealthy, but the cost of purchasing your freedom was always kept just beyond reach, and those costs could be increased arbitrarily. Suddenly you owed more for your training, your equipment, your housing than you'd previously been told. Even the most successful gladiators found themselves trapped in debt cycles. Every victory brought new obligations, better equipment that had to be purchased, medical treatment for injuries, fees for specialized training. The accounting was deliberately opaque, making it nearly impossible to determine how much you actually owed or how close you were to earning freedom. Some gladiators were owned by wealthy individuals who treated them as personal investments and status symbols. These fighters might receive better treatment and training, but they were also more valuable and therefore less likely to be released. A senator who owned a famous gladiator wasn't going to let his entertainment investment walk away. The rental system was particularly cruel. Gladiator schools would loan fighters to other cities for games, collecting appearance fees while the gladiators risked their lives in unfamiliar arenas against unknown opponents. You had no say in these arrangements and saw none of the rental income. Insurance markets even developed around gladiator mortality. Wealthy patrons could purchase policies that would compensate them if their expensive fighter died before generating sufficient revenue. This created incentives to keep gladiators alive just long enough to be profitable, while ensuring they didn't survive long enough to become liabilities. The entire system was designed to extract maximum value from human lives while providing just enough hope to maintain cooperation. Gladiators weren't just fighting other fighters or wild animals, they were fighting an economic structure specifically, engineered to prevent their escape. Even death didn't end the financial calculations. Successful gladiators' names and reputations could be sold to other fighters, their equipment auctioned to the highest bidder, their bodies sometimes sold to medical schools for anatomical study. The business of gladiatorial entertainment found ways to profit from every aspect of a fighter's existence, including its end. This wasn't just ancient capitalism, it was a systematic approach to human commodification that made escape nearly impossible even for the most successful fighters. The economics of gladiatorial combat weren't designed to create heroes or enable dramatic escapes. They were designed to generate profit from human suffering while maintaining the illusion that freedom was achievable through skill and courage. The psychological warfare began long before you entered the arena because Roman crowd management was a sophisticated art designed to manipulate both gladiators and spectators into providing maximum entertainment value. Understanding how audiences were prepared for violence helps explain why gladiator games were so psychologically devastating. For the participants, pre-fight publicity was crucial for building audience anticipation and betting interest. Your background would be embellished or completely fabricated to create compelling narratives. A common criminal might become a fallen nobleman seeking redemption. A prisoner of war might be transformed into a barbarian prince fighting for his homeland's honor. Truth was irrelevant. Emotional investment was everything. These fabricated stories served multiple purposes. They gave audiences someone to cheer. For or against, they justified the violence by creating moral frameworks, and they dehumanized the fighters by reducing them to characters in a drama rather than people facing death. The day of the games, crowd psychology was carefully orchestrated. Opening ceremonies included religious rituals that sanctified the violence, political speeches that connected the games to imperial glory and displays of exotic animals or prisoners, that demonstrated Roman power over the natural and human worlds. By the time gladiators entered the arena, audiences had been primed for hours to see violence as entertainment, death as justice, and suffering as spectacle. The fighters weren't just facing individual opponents, they were confronting thousands of people who had been psychologically prepared to enjoy watching them die. The famous thumbs up or down gesture wasn't a simple crowd vote. It was a carefully managed theatrical moment that gave audiences the illusion of power while ensuring that the most entertaining outcome was chosen. Game organizers influenced these decisions through subtle cues, planted audience members, and economic considerations about which fighter was more valuable alive. Even the arena's physical design was psychological warfare. The high walls prevented escape while creating acoustic properties that amplified crowd noise. Gladiators heard every cheer, every boo, every betting call. The psychological pressure was designed to be overwhelming, making even experienced fighters prone to mistakes. Underground holding areas were deliberately cramped and uncomfortable, keeping fighters in heightened states of anxiety before their matches. Some gladiators spent hours listening to the sounds of combat above them, hearing the cheers when their colleagues won or the silence when they died. The unpredictability was intentional. Gladiators might be told they were fighting condemned criminals only to face experienced fighters. Rules could change without notice. Equipment might be modified at the last moment. This constant uncertainty prevented fighters from developing confidence or tactical familiarity. Music and sound effects were used to manipulate crowd emotions and fighter psychology. Dramatic horns announced entrances, drums built tension during combat, and specific musical cues signaled particular types of violence. Even the acoustics of gladiator death were choreographed for maximum impact. Post-fight rituals continued the psychological manipulation. Winners were required to pose dramatically with their fallen opponents, creating iconic images that reinforced the entertainment. Value of the violence. Bodies were removed quickly and efficiently, minimizing any emotional impact that might interfere with the next match. The cumulative effect was devastating for gladiator psychology. They learned that their emotions, their fears, their pain, and their deaths were all just elements in someone else's entertainment. There was no private space for grief, no moment when their humanity was acknowledged, no recognition that they were people rather than performers. This systematic psychological dehumanization explains why so few gladiators successfully escaped their circumstances. They weren't just fighting physical opponents, they were fighting a social system specifically designed to break their spirits. While maintaining their usefulness as entertainment, the crowd wasn't just watching violence, they were participating in a carefully orchestrated psychological destruction that turned human beings into objects for consumption. And the gladiators knew it, which might have been the most devastating psychological warfare of all. Medical care for gladiators reveals another layer of the system's calculated cruelty. Roman physicians who worked with gladiators were skilled practitioners who developed sophisticated techniques for treating combat injuries, but their primary goal wasn't healing. It was maintaining valuable property in fighting condition. Gladiator medicine was surprisingly advanced for its time. Doctors learned to treat everything from simple cuts to complex bone fractures, developing techniques that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for centuries. They understood infection control, performed surgical procedures, and even developed early forms of physical therapy. But this medical expertise served economic rather than humanitarian purposes. A gladiator who could be quickly patched up and returned to fighting was more profitable than one who died from treatable injuries. Schools invested in medical care not out of compassion, but because dead gladiators generated no revenue. The quality of medical treatment you received depended entirely on your value as a fighter. Promising young gladiators with crowd appeal might receive expensive treatments and long recovery periods. Older fighters, or those deemed less entertaining, might be given basic care or simply allowed to die if their treatment costs exceeded their potential earnings. Pain management was minimal and primarily focused on keeping fighters functional rather than comfortable. Opium-based medications existed, but were expensive and potentially addictive, making them poor investments for expendable fighters. Most gladiators learned to endure constant pain from old injuries that had healed improperly or incompletely. The psychological aspects of gladiator medicine were particularly cruel. Doctors would often discuss a fighter's condition and prognosis in front of them as if they were examining livestock. Your injuries, recovery time, and fighting potential were evaluated and discussed without any consideration for your emotional state or personal preferences. Some injuries were actually considered beneficial for entertainment purposes. Dramatic scars made fighters more visually interesting. Slight limps or other visible impairments could be incorporated into fighting personas. Gladiators learned that their medical treatment might be designed to enhance their entertainment value rather than optimize their health. Recovery periods were strictly controlled. Too much rest was seen as wasteful, but rushing fighters back into combat before they were ready risked valuable investments. Doctors had to balance the economic pressure to return gladiators to fighting, condition against the medical reality of healing times. Medical records were kept primarily for business purposes, tracking treatment costs, monitoring recovery times, and evaluating the return on investment for various types of medical care. These records provide modern historians with detailed information about gladiator injuries, but also reveal the systematic dehumanization of the medical care they received. The most skilled gladiator physicians often had backgrounds as military medics, bringing battlefield medicine techniques to arena treatment. This meant they were excellent at keeping people alive and functional in the short term, but less concerned with long-term health outcomes since most gladiators weren't expected to have long terms. Experimental medical procedures were sometimes tested on gladiators, since they were considered acceptable subjects for risky treatments that wouldn't be attempted on full citizens. Some medical advances were made through gladiator treatment, but at enormous human cost to the fighters who served as unwilling test subjects. Even successful medical treatment carried psychological burdens. Gladiators who survived serious injuries knew they were kept alive not because anyone cared about their well-being, but because they still had economic value. Recovery meant returning to the same deadly circumstances that had injured them in the first place. The medical care system perfectly encapsulated the fundamental contradiction of gladiator existence. Sophisticated and skilled treatment provided not to preserve human life, but to maximize the entertainment value of human death. Even healing was commodified, another element in the complex machinery of Roman spectacle. Now let's examine the specific gladiator types, because the Roman arena wasn't just random violence, it was carefully choreographed theater where different fighting styles represented different dramatic roles, each designed to maximize entertainment value while playing on audience prejudices and fantasies. The most recognizable gladiator type was the Murmillo, equipped with a large rectangular shield, a gladius sword, and a distinctive helmet with a fish-shaped crest. These fighters represented the ideal Roman soldier, disciplined and heavily armored. They were typically matched against lighter, more agile opponents to create dramatic contrasts between strength and speed. Retieri were perhaps the most visually distinctive gladiators, fighting with nets, tridents, and minimal armor. They represented the exotic fisherman, relying on entanglement and reach rather than direct combat. Their fights were often the most unpredictable, since a successful net throw could end a match instantly, while a failed attempt left them vulnerable to heavily armed opponents. Thracians carried curved swords called seke and small, round shields. They wore distinctive helmets with wide brims and often fought in a crouched, defensive style. These gladiators represented the barbarian warrior, emphasizing cunning and unconventional tactics over Roman military discipline. Secutaries were literally chasers, designed specifically to fight retieri. They carried equipment similar to myrmidons, but with helmets that had limited vision holes, supposedly to protect against trident strikes. The irony was that their protective gear often made them more vulnerable by restricting their ability to see attacks. Provocators were among the most heavily armored gladiators, carrying large shields, breastplates, and helmets. They typically fought other provocators in matches that emphasized endurance and tactical skill over quick victories. These fights could last for hours, testing the crowd's patience as much as the fighter's stamina. The Hoplomachii fought in Greek style with spears, small round shields, and armor that recalled classical Greek warriors. They represented the conquered but respected military traditions of Greece, allowing Romans to simultaneously celebrate their superiority over an appreciation for Greek culture. Each gladiator type had specific training regimens, dietary requirements, and fighting techniques. But more importantly, they each represented different aspects of Roman social and cultural anxieties. Barbarian gladiators allowed audiences to see foreign enemies defeated safely. Military-style gladiators reinforced Roman martial values. Exotic fighters satisfied curiosity about the wider world while confirming Roman superiority. The matchups were carefully planned to create dramatic narratives. Speed versus strength, discipline versus cunning, Roman technique versus barbarian ferocity. Each fight told a story that audiences understood intuitively, even if they didn't consciously recognize the propaganda elements. But for the gladiators themselves, these type distinctions were often arbitrary and limiting. You didn't choose your fighting style based on personal preference or natural ability. You were assigned a type based on what the school needed, what the market demanded, or what story the promoters wanted to tell. Training for each type was rigidly specialized. Retieri learned net techniques that were useless in any other context. Myrmidons developed fighting styles that depended on specific armor and weapons. This specialization made gladiators more entertaining, but also more vulnerable. Take away their signature equipment, and many fighters were helpless. The type system also created artificial hierarchies among gladiators. Some styles were considered more prestigious, others more desperate. These distinctions affected everything from training quality to living conditions to potential earnings. Even among the enslaved and condemned, social stratification persisted. Most cruelly, the type assignments often had nothing to do with a gladiator's background or abilities. A former Roman soldier might be forced to fight as a barbarian. A Greek intellectual might be equipped as a primitive warrior. The arena didn't just exploit people's deaths, it perverted their identities for entertainment. The gladiator types weren't just fighting categories. They were elaborate costumes for a theater of death, where the actors had no choice in their roles, and the play always ended with someone dying for the audience's amusement. The infrastructure required to support gladiatorial games was staggering in its complexity and cost, representing one of the most sophisticated entertainment industries in the ancient world. Understanding this system reveals how deeply embedded gladiatorial combat was in Roman society and economy. Major amphitheaters like the Colosseum weren't just buildings. They were engineering marvels that required constant maintenance, specialized staff, and enormous resources to operate. The underground hypogeum contained a network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical devices that could raise animals, gladiators, and stage props to arena level with split-second timing. The logistics of feeding 50,000 spectators required extensive planning and supply chains. Food vendors, wine sellers, and souvenir merchants all depended on regular games for their livelihoods. The economic impact of a major gladiatorial event rippled through entire cities, affecting everything from transportation to accommodation. Animal procurement was a massive international operation. Lions from Africa, bears from Germany, exotic creatures from across the empire all had to be captured, transported, housed, and fed until they were needed for the games. This created entire industries dedicated to supplying the arena's appetite. For exotic violence, the betting infrastructure was equally complex. Professional bookmakers calculated odds, managed enormous sums of money, and maintained security systems to prevent fraud. Some bets involved futures markets, with people wagering on gladiators' long-term survival prospects months in advance. Gladiator schools themselves were substantial business operations. The largest schools housed hundreds of fighters, trainers, guards, cooks, armorers, and medical staff. They maintained their own farms to produce food, workshops to create equipment, and burial grounds for fighters who didn't survive. The scheduling and promotion of games required sophisticated coordination between multiple cities, schools, and sponsors. Gladiators had to be transported, matched according to entertainment value, and marketed to audiences weeks in advance. The logistics resembled modern professional sports more than simple local entertainment. construction and maintenance of amphitheaters employed thousands of workers, architects, engineers, stonemasons, carpenters, painters, and laborers. The Colosseum alone required a permanent staff just to maintain the mechanical systems that made the spectacles possible. Medical infrastructure included not just gladiator physicians, but also emergency treatment facilities for spectators injured in crowd incidents. Large games attracted people from hundreds of miles away, requiring temporary medical services for visitors unfamiliar with local conditions. Security for major games involved coordinating urban cohorts, Praetorian guards, and local militias. The combination of large crowds, heavy drinking, passionate betting, and political tensions made gladiatorial events potential flashpoints for civil unrest. The financial scale was enormous. A single day of games in Rome could cost more than most. Cities' annual budgets, wealthy individuals sponsored games to gain political favor, while emperors used them to demonstrate power and maintain public support. Trade networks developed specifically to supply arena needs. Merchants specialized in gladiator equipment, exotic animals, rare medicines, and luxury foods for VIP spectators. These industries existed nowhere else in the ancient world and disappeared. When the games ended, even waste management was a specialized operation. The amount of blood, body parts, animal carcasses, and general refuse generated by major games required organized disposal systems. Some materials were sold: gladiator blood for supposed medicinal purposes, animal parts for various uses. The infrastructure of gladiatorial entertainment represented a massive investment of human and material resources in systematic violence. It wasn't just cruelty, it was industrialized cruelty, supported by some of the most advanced organizational systems in the ancient world. This sophisticated infrastructure also explains why gladiatorial games persisted for so long. Too many people's livelihoods depended on the system for it to be easily reformed or eliminated. The games weren't just entertainment, they were a fundamental part of the Roman economy. Let's delve into the animals of the arena, because gladiators weren't just fighting each other, they were facing creatures specifically chosen and conditioned to kill humans as dramatically as possible. The Venetians, or animal hunts, were elaborate spectacles that revealed both Roman engineering prowess and systematic cruelty toward the natural world. Lions were the most prized arena animals, shipped from North Africa in enormous quantities. But these weren't just any lions. They were specifically selected for aggression and size, then deliberately starved before arena appearances to ensure they would attack immediately upon release. The logistics of maintaining hundreds of large predators in underground chambers beneath amphitheaters was staggering. Bears presented different challenges. European brown bears were captured in Germania and Gaul, then transported in specially constructed cages to Roman cities. Unlike lions, bears were omnivores who could be kept alive on cheaper diets. But they were also more unpredictable in their behavior, sometimes refusing to attack humans or attempting to escape rather than fight. Exotic animals from across the empire served multiple purposes in the arena. Elephants from Africa and India demonstrated Roman power over distant lands while providing spectacular, if expensive, entertainment. Crocodiles from Egypt required specialized aquatic facilities. Leopards, tigers, and other big cats each demanded different handling techniques and security measures. The conditioning process for arena animals was deliberately brutal. Captured predators were kept in cramped, uncomfortable conditions that increased their aggression. They were fed irregular meals, often including human flesh, to develop a taste for it. Some animals were deliberately injured or tormented to ensure they would be sufficiently vicious during performances. Training animals for specific arena behaviors required specialized knowledge that developed into a distinct profession. Bestiarii were professional animal fighters who understood how to provoke particular responses from different species. They knew which animals could be safely approached, which would charge immediately, and which required specific stimuli to attack. The matchups between gladiators and animals weren't random encounters. They were carefully choreographed performances designed to create specific dramatic effects. A fast gladiator might face multiple smaller predators to showcase agility. A heavily armored fighter might confront a single large animal in a test of strength versus raw power. Some animal fights involved elaborate staging that transformed the arena floor into artificial landscapes. Forests were constructed for deer hunts, artificial lakes created for aquatic animal displays, and mechanical devices used to release animals. At precisely timed intervals for maximum dramatic impact, the scale of animal slaughter was unprecedented in human history. Single games might feature hundreds of exotic creatures killed for entertainment. The Colosseum's inaugural games reportedly featured 9,000 animals killed over 100 days. This industrial-scale destruction of wildlife contributed to extinctions. Across the Roman Empire, many animals were drugged or injured before arena appearances to ensure they would behave predictably. Predators might be given stimulants to increase aggression, while herbivores could be drugged to make them easier targets. For hunters, the goal was entertainment, not fair competition between humans and animals. The economic impact of arena animal procurement was enormous. Entire regions specialized in capturing specific species for Roman entertainment. Professional animal dealers developed international networks, transportation systems, and holding facilities. The demand for exotic creatures affected ecosystems across 3 continents. Some animals were trained to perform specific behaviors rather than simply kill. Elephants might be taught to execute condemned criminals in particular ways. Dogs could be conditioned to attack specific targets. These performances combined animal training with human execution in spectacles that satisfied multiple entertainment demands simultaneously. The care and feeding of arena animals represented a significant ongoing expense. Large predators required fresh meat daily, exotic species needed specialized diets, and medical care for valuable animals could be extensive. Some facilities employed full-time veterinarians just to maintain animal collections. Even the disposal of animal carcasses required organized systems. Hundreds of dead animals from a single day's games created massive waste management challenges. Some meat was distributed to the poor, some sold to butchers, and some simply hauled. Away to disposal sites outside the city, the animals of the arena weren't just victims. They were unwilling performers in a vast theater of death, where human creativity was dedicated to making killing as entertaining as possible. Their suffering was choreographed, their deaths were scripted, and their lives were reduced to nothing more than elements in someone, else's entertainment as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and social attitudes began shifting. The traditional gladiator games came under increasing criticism. Not because of their violence, Romans had always been comfortable with violence, but because Christian theology challenged the moral framework that made arena deaths seem acceptable. Early Christian writers like Augustine and John Chrysostom condemned the games not just as pagan rituals, but as fundamentally corrupting to both participants and audiences. They argued that taking pleasure in human suffering was incompatible with Christian teachings about human dignity and divine love, but the games didn't disappear overnight. They evolved, gradually becoming less frequent, less elaborate, and less central to Roman social life. Economic pressures played a role to maintaining gladiator schools and staging. Elaborate spectacles became increasingly expensive as the empire faced military and financial challenges. The last recorded gladiator fights took place in the early 5th century CE, not because of imperial decree, but because the social and economic systems that supported them had finally collapsed. The arena had outlasted the peak of Roman power, but it couldn't survive the empire's transformation into something fundamentally different. Yet, the legacy of arena entertainment didn't vanish. It evolved into other forms of spectacle that preserved some elements while abandoning others. Medieval tournaments, public executions, and even modern sporting events all carry echoes of the Roman games. The architecture survived too. Many Roman amphitheaters were converted into fortifications, housing, or Christian churches, but they remained as physical reminders of what the empire had been. The Colosseum itself became a symbol not just of Roman achievement, but of Roman excess. Modern archaeological work has revealed the sophistication, engineering, and complex social systems that made the games possible, but it has also uncovered evidence of the human cost. Gladiator cemeteries filled with young men who died violent deaths, medical records showing the treatments for arena injuries, and financial documents that calculated the precise value of human lives. The arena represents both the best and worst of Roman civilization. Architectural genius and engineering brilliance used to create systematic dehumanization, artistic sophistication serving moral barbarism, social unity built on the suffering of the powerless. Perhaps that's why the gladiator story continues to fascinate us. It's not just ancient history. It's a warning about what happens when entertainment becomes more important than humanity, when spectacle replaces empathy, when entire societies learn to mistake cruelty for strength. The gladiators are gone, but the arena's lessons remain, that civilization is fragile, that moral progress isn't inevitable, and that the greatest danger to human dignity often comes not from obvious enemies, but from the everyday choices of ordinary people who learn to see suffering as acceptable. In the end, the Roman arena wasn't just about gladiators fighting animals or each other. It was about an entire civilization fighting itself and losing. But there's more to understand about this system of organized brutality. Let's examine the role of slavery in gladiatorial entertainment, because the arena was fundamentally built on the Roman institution of human bondage. And understanding this connection reveals how deeply the games were embedded in the empire's social and economic foundations. Most gladiators began as slaves, but the path from bondage to arena was neither direct nor simple. Slave dealers operated sophisticated networks that identified potential fighters from among prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and people sold into slavery for debt. Not every slave became a gladiator. It required specific physical and psychological characteristics that made the investment worthwhile. The slave markets that supplied gladiator schools were brutal assessment centers where human beings were evaluated like livestock. Potential gladiators were examined for muscle tone, reflexes, aggression levels, and pain tolerance. Dealers looked for young men with military experience, physical strength, and the kind of desperation that made them willing to fight rather than accept. Passive slavery, but slavery in gladiator schools was different from household or agricultural slavery. Gladiator slaves were valuable assets who received better food, medical care, and living conditions than most other enslaved people. This created a perverse hierarchy where the most dangerous and violent form of slavery came with the best material treatment. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. Slaves who might have maintained hope for eventual freedom in other circumstances found themselves trapped in a form of bondage that offered only death or continued violence as outcomes. The better treatment wasn't kindness. It was livestock management designed to maximize the value of human property. Some gladiators were volunteers who sold themselves into slavery specifically to enter the arena. These individuals, called octorati, were typically free men who had lost everything through debt, crime, or social disgrace. They traded their legal freedom for the slim possibility of earning enough prize money to buy their way back to respectability. The contracts that bound volunteer gladiators were deliberately complex, and one-sided. The legal language was designed to trap signers in perpetual servitude while maintaining the fiction that they had chosen their fate. Once you signed, the practical difference between volunteer and enslaved gladiator disappeared almost entirely. Manumission, the legal process of freeing slaves, was theoretically possible for successful gladiators, but the requirements were deliberately extreme. You might need to survive a specific number of fights, accumulate a certain amount of prize money, and receive approval from multiple authorities. Even then, freedom could be revoked for virtually any reason. The children of gladiator slaves inherited their parents' status, creating multi-generational families trapped in the arena system. These children were often raised from birth to become fighters, receiving specialized training from early childhood. They knew no other life and had no concept of existence outside the gladiatorial world. Female slaves faced additional horrors in the arena system. Some became gladiatrixes, fighting for entertainment, while others were used as sexual rewards. For successful male gladiators, or simply as breeding stock to produce the next generation of fighters. Their bodies were commodified in every possible way. The economic calculations surrounding gladiator slaves were coldly precise. Owners tracked training costs, medical expenses, equipment investments, and projected earnings for each fighter. These human beings were literally reduced to profit and loss statements, with their lives valued only in terms of entertainment revenue. Escaped gladiator slaves faced particularly harsh punishments, because their specialized combat training made them dangerous fugitives. Recapture usually meant immediate execution or assignment to fights against impossible odds. The few who successfully escaped often became bandits or mercenaries, unable to reintegrate into normal society. The slave economy that supported gladiatorial games extended far beyond the fighters themselves. Trainers, guards, cooks, armorers, animal handlers, and countless others were often slaves, whose lives were entirely dedicated to maintaining the system that destroyed their fellow human beings for entertainment. Even freed gladiators remained, marked by their association with slavery. Roman society never fully accepted former arena fighters as legitimate citizens, viewing them as permanently tainted by their violent past and servile origins. Freedom from the arena often meant freedom, to be scorned and marginalized rather than genuine liberation. The intersection of slavery and gladiatorial entertainment reveals how the Roman Empire's economic prosperity was built on systematic dehumanization. The same society that produced remarkable art, literature, and philosophy also created industrial-scale human exploitation that treated people as disposable entertainment products. Understanding this slave foundation helps explain why gladiatorial games persisted for centuries despite their obvious cruelty. They weren't aberrations or temporary excesses. They were logical extensions of a society that had already accepted the fundamental premise that some human beings existed solely for the benefit of others. Let's also explore the political dimensions of gladiatorial entertainment, because the arena wasn't just a place of violence, it was a sophisticated tool of social control and political manipulation that helped maintain the Roman Empire's complex power structures. Emperors and ambitious politicians used gladiatorial games as a form of bread and circuses, providing free entertainment to urban populations who might otherwise focus their energies on political grievances. The massive expense of staging games was considered a worthwhile investment in social stability and political legitimacy. The timing of major gladiatorial events was carefully coordinated with political needs. Games might be scheduled to distract from unpopular policies, celebrate military victories, or commemorate imperial anniversaries. The arena became a stage where political messages were communicated through spectacle rather than explicit propaganda. Crowd reactions during games provided valuable intelligence about public opinion. Politicians and emperors paid close attention to which gladiators were cheered, which types of spectacles generated enthusiasm, and how audiences responded to different elements of the entertainment. The arena functioned as a massive, ongoing public opinion poll. The seating arrangements in amphitheaters reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. Senators sat closest to the action, citizens filled the middle sections, and slaves occupied the upper levels. Everyone knew their place, literally and figuratively, and these arrangements were strictly enforced to maintain social order. Wealthy individuals gained political capital by sponsoring games, demonstrating their generosity and commitment to public entertainment. The cost of staging elaborate spectacles was enormous, but the political benefits could be substantial. Successful game sponsors often parlayed their popularity into higher political offices. The arena also served as a venue for displaying Roman power to foreign visitors and conquered peoples. Diplomatic delegations, tribal leaders, and potential enemies were invited to witness the empire's wealth, organizational capability, and willingness to use violence. The message was unmistakable. This is what Rome can do for entertainment. Imagine what we can do to enemies. Regional variations in gladiatorial preferences provided insights into local cultures and potential sources of unrest. Areas that consistently favored barbarian-style fighters might harbor anti-Roman sentiment, while regions that enthusiastically supported traditional Roman gladiator types demonstrated their integration into imperial culture. The betting systems that surrounded gladiatorial games created additional opportunities for political intelligence gathering and manipulation. Unusual betting patterns might indicate planned uprisings, foreign influence, or other security threats. Some bets were placed with political rather than financial motivations. Gladiatorial schools themselves became centers of political intrigue. Wealthy owners often had their own political agendas, and successful gladiators could become pawns in larger power struggles. The personal relationships between politicians and prominent fighters were closely monitored by security services. The arena provided a controlled environment for releasing social tensions that might otherwise manifest as political opposition. Citizens could express frustration, aggression, and tribal loyalties through their support for particular gladiators without directly challenging the political system. It was emotional catharsis that actually strengthened, rather than threatened, the status quo. Even the religious aspects of gladiatorial games served political purposes. By framing the violence as offerings to the gods or sacred rituals, the state could present systematic cruelty as religious duty. This gave moral legitimacy to practices that might otherwise be seen as simple brutality. The decline of gladiatorial games coincided with the empire's political transformation. As Christianity gained influence and traditional Roman values weakened, the arena lost much of its effectiveness as a tool of social control. New forms of entertainment and political manipulation became necessary to maintain imperial authority. The political legacy of gladiatorial entertainment extends beyond ancient Rome. The concept of using spectacular violence to distract and control populations has been replicated throughout history, often by governments seeking to maintain power through entertainment rather than addressing underlying social problems. Understanding the political dimensions of gladiatorial games reveals how entertainment can become a form of social control, how spectacle can substitute for genuine political participation, and how societies can be persuaded to accept systematic cruelty if it's packaged as exciting entertainment. The arena wasn't just where gladiators died, it was where democratic impulses, social conscience, and moral reasoning were systematically undermined through the seductive power of organized violence presented as harmless fun so as dawn approaches. And these tales of ancient entertainment begin to fade like morning mist over the 7 hills. Remember that the human capacity for both cruelty and dignity has always existed side by side. Testing our choices and defining our civilizations, the Romans may have built their empire with military precision and legal innovation, but they filled their arenas with the same moral contradictions that challenge us today. Their gladiators may have worn different armor and fought with different weapons, but they faced the same fundamental questions about survival, meaning, and the price of entertaining others. Their sand may have been different, their crowds unfamiliar, their gods forgotten, but their struggles echo in every contemporary debate about violence as entertainment, about human dignity in systems designed to deny it, about the difference between existing and living meaningfully across the centuries. Their stories still carry lessons about power and powerlessness, about the courage required to maintain humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, and about the eternal human refusal to be reduced to nothing more than spectacle for others' consumption. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of an unbroken chain of moral choice that stretches from the blood-soaked sand of ancient arenas to your own quiet bedroom tonight. The empire may have fallen, the gladiators forgotten, but the questions they faced endure, as they always have, as they always will. And perhaps that's the most important thing they taught us, that in the end, it's not how we die that defines us, but how we choose to live while we're here.